An interesting quote by Susie Wiles, Donald Trump's chief of staff, to Sarah Smith from the BBC. And Sarah Smith had said to her, well, after this trip, is the UK going to find it easier to influence, US foreign policy, US decisions? And she said the trip wouldn't make a difference effectively.
Donald Trump is back in the US after a state visit, which he seemed to enjoy. Both he and Sir Keir Starmer were delighted to announce a new tech deal, and there were warm words and big smiles. One substantial point of difference, however, is clearly Gaza. The UK is poised to recognise Palestinian statehood, could be as early as today, yet the US remains fiercely opposing it, arguing it would reward Hamas terrorism. So the Prime Minister appears to have established a bond of trust and mutual respect with the President, but is there any evidence to suggest the White House will budge on its position? Let's speak now to Katy Balls, the Times Washington editor. Morning, Katy.
Morning.
I mean, Downing Street clearly breathing a sigh of relief. They're probably relieved that Donald Trump has gone on his way and there were no major hiccups, or no real hiccups at all. From a Trump perspective, what will he be taking away from this?
I think from the Trump perspective, the president will be taking away photos of himself and the royal family and memories. And I think also a little bit of a sense that he has made history here. And I don't think you can really overstate that feeling that of pride that the president has. We know how much he loves the monarchy. And this trip really was more, I think, for him about the monarchy than government business. There are still some good things there that they like. But when you speak to those around Donald Trump, they will say the UK has effectively given him a piece of history by making him the only president with 2 state visits. And that's something he, as someone who wants to show that his legacy is better than those that came before, is quite important to him.
Was it a success because Keir Starmer didn't really stand up to him?
Well, I don't think state visits are necessarily for standing up to your guest in some ways. I mean, why are you rolling out the red carpet?
I guess I'm thinking, Katy, more from the kind of the checkers perspective. Clearly not the king and the pomp and the pageantry and the first day.
Yeah.
But at checkers yesterday, I mean, Starmer's critics will say he just basically appeased Donald Trump. And that's why it's been a success, because he didn't try and do anything that was tricky.
Yeah, but I think to your point, why are you having a state visit? You're expecting to roll out the red carpet and then try and get some wins around with it. And therefore, even if you are trying to change the mind of your guest, you're going to do it. You've chosen the way to do it, by having this big, spectacular event. So you're going to be trying to do things behind the scenes, slow diplomacy, charm, and so forth. So I think that it was a success in the sense that they went for the flattery, the charm, the gifts, and it didn't blow up in Keir Starmer's face. There were still a few awkward moments in that press conference. If you think about, Donald Trump talking about immigration, which, how a government should do everything it can. And that clearly highlighted the differences in the UK and US response. The implication was the UK is not doing enough. Energy, Palestine, as you mentioned. But I think they'll be saying, look at this tech partnership. There was an interesting quote by Susie Wiles, Donald Trump's chief of staff, to Sarah Smith from the BBC. And Sarah Smith had said to her, well, after this trip, is the UK going to find it easier to influence, US foreign policy, US decisions? And she said the trip wouldn't make a difference effectively, which I don't think was the ideal soundbite for the government after going all this way.
What is the relationship like between Trump and Starmer? Because lots of people seem a little bit confused that 2 men who are clearly politically quite a way away from each other, seemingly, from what we see, look like they do get on pretty well. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, people on both sides and obviously in politics, both in Westminster and Washington, there is a lot of spin. But generally speaking, people who, I would trust the opinion of most of the time will say, no, they do get on. Now, you look at the pair and you think, what are they talking about? Where is their shared hinterland? Even if you think about, presidents and prime ministers in the past from different parties, Blair and Bush, for example, I think you could sense more where they might meet in their ideas. I think what helps with Keir Starmer is the fact that he doesn't wear himself too heavily in terms of having a big ego. Perhaps that people like Emmanuel Macron might come across a bit more like the question of who is the alpha, the dominant man in this conversation, and Donald Trump gets to own it. But I think in a way, Keir Starmer has been very polite. He's also worked out that Donald Trump likes compliments and flattery, and he's also worked out that he likes the royal family. And you put those all together, and I think it's just been quite a sophisticated operation in terms of what cards does the UK play and how do we play them.
I mean, you mentioned Palestine and the huge difference in opinion there. Can Donald Trump be adult enough to say we can agree to disagree on this one?
But that was almost the sense from the press conference yesterday. He said, this is one of our few differences. I think the word few was perhaps doing a lot of work if you think about the actual number of things they disagree on. Perhaps I think it was more, I think one of the few differences he would decide to, lean into in a press conference where he was on his very best behavior. So I think there will be criticism and unhappiness on the Republican side of the UK taking this stance, but it clearly isn't a deal breaker in terms of communications in this relationship. I think that's probably the takeaway there. There were lots of issues where I think Donald Trump could have made Keir Starmer's life a bit more difficult yesterday. And of course, the last state visit, he did make Theresa May's life quite difficult. So generally speaking, it was softly. But I would just note briefly, even after the visit ended and he gave an interview to Fox News, that was a bit more critical, talking about how difficult, changing the trade deal was and so forth. So I wonder if, in terms of how soft Donald Trump was going to go in the UK, probably you couldn't get him on better behaviour than in Chequers after spending the night with the royal family.
Where do you think the relationship goes from here? I mean, clearly this was all about, as you say, flattering Donald Trump, presumably trying to get movement on Ukraine, maybe a bit more pressure applied from the UK government's perspective on the Israeli government. I'm just wondering, now Donald Trump's got his state visit, does he just go home and go, well, I'll do what I like now?
But I think in many ways, the state visit was seen as the bit of Donald Trump's schedule in the coming weeks that he was quite looking forward to. And one figure on the American side said to me, it's a nice way to cap off the summer. He began summer at Trump Turnberry, he ended it here. Whereas obviously when you speak to the UK side, there, this is all about deals, investment. So I think and the truth is, as Donald Trump is now back in DC, he has some really big things coming up. Obviously, Charlie Kirk's funeral on Sunday, the United Nations Assembly Tuesday. I don't think they're going to spend that much time now thinking about, what more they can do with the UK. Not to say they don't want to. It's almost just a case of, that box is ticked, back to the America First agenda now. I think it has, of course, though, brought the UK some goodwill, and therefore if the UK need to get a phone call, be a voice in a room, it will be important there. And I think perhaps that's a better way to judge this, which is rather than are all the tariffs gone? No. Will Keir Starmer be able to decide the US's policy on Ukraine and Palestine? No. But if you look at it in the realm of how other countries are treated, I think figures in Megra will say, well, look, you're doing a lot better than a lot of other European countries. And that is probably what these types of visits and efforts get you.
So what do we do for the rest of the term then? The state visit's gone, the carrot has been dangled, it's been clutched, he's eaten it. Then what? Where do we go from here to keep him on side?
Well, this is slightly the question. And when they made the decision, of course, to offer this state visit on the first visit of Keir Starmer to DC, let's say it was a bit early, not just in terms of preparation, but what else do you have? And it was reported back in February. There's more reports today that King Charles could head to America for the 250th anniversary of independence. That was in the works, I think, from early this year in terms of something the King could do if he was in well enough health. There's more today suggesting that could go ahead. So I think the question is, how much can you wheel the royals out effectively in the next 3 years? I think a third state visit would really be quite hard to do, if we're being honest. That would suggest that things have gone really quite bad if they had to try and do that. But I think meetings with the royal family, and also I think, other honours you can bestow, I think is all about the history of the UK and the part that when you look at this Trump administration, there's a lot of Anglo, they love Britain in some ways, but it's a very certain type of Britain they have an affection for, and it's quite a nostalgic type of Britain. I think if we're being honest, if you think about, they like the pomp, the ceremony, they like the history, they, the shared efforts in World War II, the fact that they looked at the Winston Churchill archives. So I think even if you get past the royal family, I think parts of the relationship that speak to that are going to be the best way to get the White House listening.
Katy, thank you so much. That's Katy Balls, the Times Washington editor. Katy's written a great piece in the Times today, sort of summing up what has come out of the state visit. I think, she sums it up quite well there, doesn't she? That the UK will be a voice in the room. The UK's done better than other European countries, be grateful for it. I was just looking up, as Katy was saying, the 250th anniversary of the US. That is on the 4th of July next year. So could it be that King Charles could be making a little trip to the US just as another thing to keep, do we do a yearly check-in with Donald Trump to keep him happy with the royals?
That's right. Peter Kyle for the government this morning didn't rule out a third state visit, did he, when we put that to him?
He wasn't massively up for the idea either, but he was, yes, yeah.
I do think as well, there are still some friction and points and flash points to come. So this recognition of a Palestinian state, I think, is one for the Labour Party to really contend with in the next couple of days. It looks like it will happen this weekend, that they will recognise a Palestinian state. Does that mean then there will be sanctions on Israel based on the conditions that were put in place for recognition of a Palestinian state to happen? Presumably they have not been met in the eyes of the Labour Party, and so does Israel face any sort of punishment? And is that a flashpoint domestically for backbenchers and indeed for President Trump, a great ally of Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel? There is lots still to unfold in the aftermath of this state visit.